This story begins in the flourishing city of Kanho, at the prestigious school of Huashanya, where not ordinary children studied, but special ones. And here is our main character, Jongsu. He was a teenage boy, always surrounded by a heap of problems. Once, because of him, the Hall of Knowledge collapsed. In truth, Jongsu was not a bad kid. His teacher, Chamhwe, knew this. He promised to teach the boy the martial art and sword technique of the blooming dark plum. Jongsu absorbed all the knowledge that was given to him. Therefore, the principal of Huashanya, Chamhwe, wanted to overlook some of his actions. But due to the outrage of others, punishment had to be administered, and Chamhwe sentenced Jongsu to 3 years of confinement. The boy was shocked. He thought it was some kind of mistake, as he had previously gotten away with everything. But when he was caught, Jongsu realized that there was no mistake at all. Principal Chamhwe asked if his colleagues were satisfied now, but the teachers were still furious, as they considered Jongsu a spark that could ignite a fire at any moment. However, this was not the only problem in the city of Kanho. An hour earlier, the teachers had spoken of Murim asking for their help due to the emergence of demons, and the principal wanted to send Jongsu to them. They did not know the details, but the demons had risen from the dead and craved human flesh. The teachers wanted to know if this posed a danger to them, but the principal assured them that they would be safe, yet the situation would sow panic among the people. The teachers agreed that this needed to be addressed, but they did not understand why the principal proposed Jongsu. No one received an answer to this question. For 3 hours later, Jongsu found himself in the heart of Mount Chamhwe. The boy simply could not believe this was happening. The fact that Jongsu still could not accept the situation further irritated the teachers. They had not taught him this way, so they simply shoved the poor boy into a cave, after which they locked it. Jongsu found himself alone, outraged that they had promised to teach him. He had the thought of breaking a hole in the cave, but that would surely not go unpunished. So he simply accepted the situation. Jongsu had a feeling that they knew he was searching for the sword of the blooming plum. Did the teachers truly value it so much? He realized how self-satisfied and cunning they all were. But this could only be said about the old ones. His sister was unlikely to grow up like that. The blooming plum blossomed even in darkness, and the whole earth was filled with its fragrance. Meanwhile, events shifted to Chamhwe's residence. There, the principal and a teacher discussed Jongsu's confinement. There were other reasons why Chamhwe acted this way. The teacher asked how the situation with OK Yang was progressing, as he had recently been meeting with very suspicious individuals. The principal said that they did not yet have enough evidence and needed more time. The situation in Kanho was also taking a turn for the worse, as Chamhwe planned to send Jongsu there, but did not expect the boy to go so far. After all, the boy did not just destroy the Hall of Knowledge. He was searching for the sword of the blooming plum there. The teacher asked what difference that would make, to which the principal simply laughed, saying it seemed he did not know Jongsu well, for soon the boy would be able to bring down Mount Chamhwe itself. The teacher said he hoped Jongsu would not cause them any more problems. Meanwhile, 3 years finally passed. The cave trembled, birds flew away as if an earthquake had occurred. After that, a strong explosion, mountains of ash and stone. A huge hole appeared in the cave, from which Jongsu emerged. He was overwhelmed with joy. The unfamiliarity made his eyes hurt from the sunlight. But Jongsu was astonished that he had truly been confined for 3 years. He had thought better of them. But all of that was unimportant now, for Jongsu was finally free, and the weather was so wonderful. Yet even this could not quell Jongsu's anger, for he had been taught manners, and the teachers themselves had not even bothered to greet him. Now he had an additional motive to find the sword of the blooming dark plum, and then they would all regret it. Jongsu returned to the school, but on the way, he did not meet a single person. Suddenly, his eyes widened sharply and the boy stopped. For the entrance to the school was completely destroyed, as if no one had been there for 100 years. Jongsu was struck dumb. He was in shock. After which, he was engulfed by aggression that someone dared to attack them. He had to find out what had happened, but going in blind was foolish. Blood boiled in Jongsu's veins at the mere thought that something had happened to his master or his sister. He would make all the scoundrels pay 1,000-fold. Jongsu leaped off the ground. He flew very far, as if he had wings. He landed on the roof of a building and simply could not believe his eyes. For all over the schoolyard, where children once roamed, now monsters wandered. They were literally everywhere. Jongsu looked closer and realized they were walking dead. What was he to do now? He had been imprisoned for so many years and knew nothing about this. But there was no time to panic. Chonsu calmed himself. He had to find out what had happened, but his mind was a jumble. Suddenly, an idea struck him that the teacher knew everything else and had acted this way with him for a reason. After which, Chonsu remembered hearing about the dead rising but could not recall where. When a messenger had come to him to convey that Changmen wanted to see Chonsu, he had said that the principal spoke of the walking dead, but then Chonsu decided he was being played and refused to believe it. But the messenger was serious. He added that the walking dead infected people through bites. Chonsu finally remembered everything. But this meant that these monsters had already reached their school. If they could withstand their school, it meant that the walking dead were very strong. However, Chonsu still hoped that the teacher was okay. Someone had to survive, and it was the boy's task to find them. He had flown too early and did not notice who had actually survived. Chonsu soared over all the monsters and landed near the entrance of the Hall of Knowledge. He entered inside. It was dark. Suddenly, a shiver ran down Chonsu's spine and he stopped abruptly, for he saw a familiar man before him. He stepped closer. It was the librarian of the Hall of Knowledge. Suddenly, his eyes glowed blue, and he screamed very loudly, so loudly that the waves of his scream knocked him off his feet like a sharp gust of air. But the worst part was that it signaled the other monsters. Their eyes also glowed blue. And the librarian of the Hall of Knowledge approached Chonsu. The boy realized they did not want to embrace him, especially when the librarian swung his bony hand with claws. He lunged at Chonsu, but the boy managed to dodge, after which he swung his fist and struck the librarian right in the face, so hard that he was thrown back. But the monster quickly recovered, and this surprised Chonsu, but the strangest part was yet to come. When the librarian suddenly began to demonstrate the technique of the blooming plum, Chonsu was shocked, for an ordinary librarian could not know martial arts. The most terrifying part was that he understood he could not dodge such an attack. He utilized the dispersing palm technique of the blooming plum. Their techniques worked against each other and simultaneously blocked each other, but no one managed to land a hit. When their powers collided together, a powerful explosion occurred from such a great concentration of energy, but they were merely thrown apart by the shockwave. Chonsu barely held himself upright. His hands trembled and pulsed. Could the librarian be this strong? But there was no time to reminisce, for the librarian was not tired in the slightest and was ready for a second round. He approached the exit and roared loudly, like a beast. At this call, as if on command, all the other monsters rushed in. Chonsu expected this to happen. He did not panic at all and was not afraid. He simply understood that the day would be tough. Although he did not know how the battle would unfold, but he certainly knew it would go as he wished. Suddenly, stones began to fall from the sky. Chonsu did not expect this. He was caught off guard. Suddenly, the stones exploded on their own. The shock wave caused wind and raised a lot of ash. But most importantly, it affected the monsters. They were all stunned, unable to even stand on their feet. Chonsu realized that this strike was intentional and looked up. There he saw someone who likely saved his life. It was a very beautiful blonde girl. She jumped down and asked why Chonsu was standing in a stupor when the smoke would soon clear and they would attack him again. Without thinking long, Chonsu also jumped away. The librarian was left only to scream in anger that his prey had escaped. Meanwhile, the boy was already almost catching up to his savior. She was surprised that Chonsu was so fast. The boy was surprised in return, as he rarely saw someone so agile. So he added speed to himself to catch up with her. Suddenly, she stopped. Chonsu followed her lead. Suddenly, the stranger turned and ran straight at Chonsu. He thought she had decided to fight him. She even grabbed his hand, but in a strange way. Suddenly, her expression changed sharply. She became very friendly and sweet. In a thin voice, she said she never thought she would meet a living person and suggested they join forces. Chonsu blushed, not understanding what this joining meant. The stranger told him that her brother was sick and she had come here to find medicine. Chonsu apologized for the foolish question, but he was curious why he suddenly had to help her. The stranger was infuriated and shouted if Chonsu was deaf, as she had proposed they unite and help each other. In response, he asked if she knew who he was and why he should help thieves at all. The stranger boiled over with anger at how stupid Chonsu was. She asked if he had seen what was happening around them. Suddenly, she understood everything. She realized that Chonsu had come down from the mountains. The boy did not understand what was so significant about that. The stranger already regretted this encounter. How could she have found herself in such a situation? Then she resigned herself and asked what Chonsu wanted in return for his help. The boy replied that first he wanted to know why the dead had come back to life, and then he would decide. The stranger had to think for a long time to recall the entire chronology. After all, it all began about 3 years ago. Somewhere at the border, a mysterious disease began to infect people, after which it spread throughout the country. Victims became literally everyone. No one could hide from the apocalypse. In the end, an army was gathered, even in the palace. But this only led to even worse consequences. The disease began to take over the palace itself. The situation had completely spiraled out of control, and when everything was ready to collapse. Then they appeared, masters of northern martial arts. They tried to fight back against the dead, but no matter how many they killed, they rose again and again. Their hope began to fade. After the palace fell, the disease seized all the powers of the world. The world turned into a bowl filled only with evil. No one could escape this terrible bloody battle. She witnessed all of this when she was very small. Jongsu asked how the hermit monks got infected. She had heard that they tried to save those who survived, but there turned out to be infected among them. Jongsu asked if he was supposed to believe that, which irritated the stranger again, after which the boy agreed to help her, but on one condition. He realized that the stranger had come from a place where there were still survivors, and Jongsu wanted to get there. She easily agreed to this. Then Jongsu asked how people had changed. After all, from what he had seen, the infected became much stronger than when they were alive. He told her about the librarian who even mastered martial arts techniques. But the stranger had not seen such beings. It seemed they were a special kind of infected who gained new abilities after death. Jongsu asked her to give an example. The stranger irritably asked if he planned to torment her with questions all night, adding that when she saw such a being, she would explain everything. But Jongsu replied that he was the one turning her into such a monster. It seemed to her that this was a threat, and she reminded him of the promise to help. To which Jongsu replied that it all depended on whether the stranger had told him the truth, after which he suggested they should leave. The stranger was surprised that it was so early, to which Jongsu replied that in the mountains, the sun rose early and dawn was approaching. The stranger complained that they hadn't even slept and that she would get wrinkles from lack of sleep. They approached the edge of the forest. The stranger advised not to break through and not to attract unnecessary attention. Jongsu said he would manage on his own and suggested she keep her promise while he kept his. She was outraged that Jongsu suddenly grumbled and added that she could keep promises. But she promised that if Jongsu got infected, there would be no talk of any promise. Suddenly, the boy jumped sharply. He landed on the ground and, with a smile, said that attracting attention was exactly what he intended to do. A sword was embedded in the ground after the battle. Jongsu extended his hand, concentrated his energy, and the sword pulled itself out of the ground. It flew to Jongsu's hands as if drawn by a magnet. It seemed he was a descendant of Thor. After such a flashy trick, Jongsu said she could not dictate to him. Then he shouted very loudly for all the monsters to come out. The stranger found it amusing and asked if there was no other way. At that moment, she suddenly realized what trouble she had brought upon herself. After which she decided that if Jongsu had chosen to die, then that was his fate, and she would handle everything herself. Meanwhile, the boy's situation was indeed not the best. Jongsu said it was simple, be careful, and not let oneself get infected. When the scent of blooming plums spread across the mountains, the plum trees began to bloom and everything was painted in white and red tones. This signaled the end of a long and harsh winter. The blooming plum was the harbinger of spring. Meanwhile, Jongsu was slicing the monster into pieces. Jongsu wielded the sword very skillfully, feeling like a fish in water. Defeating a horde of monsters with a weapon posed no problem for him. But there was still one problem left. One more monster to be precise. Suddenly, Jongsu remembered the words of his teacher, Chamhwe. He said to respect and honor one's master. Meanwhile, the stranger ran into some building. She searched with her eyes for what she had come for, and finally found a first aid kit. Now she could help her brother. But there was still something else that needed to be found. The monster Jongsu was fighting was surprisingly similar to the master from his school. The boy could not help but notice this. But despite all the sentiments, before him was no longer a teacher. This was a monster that wished nothing but death for Jongsu, and it fought very skillfully. Although Jongsu did not give up either, Chamhwe would have been proud of his student's achievements. Meanwhile, the stranger was still searching for something else. She could not linger in this place for long. Suddenly, a noise rang out. She turned sharply around and saw blue eyes in the darkness. This could only mean one thing. It was a monster that had come for her soul. Meanwhile, the monster Jongsu was fighting was already missing one arm, after which it was left without a head immediately. The master fell to the ground among the other monsters. Jongsu was irritated, wondering where all these monsters were coming from. He was starting to get tired. Suddenly, he noticed something. Just in the sky, a sort of portal had formed, glowing purple. Without thinking long, Jongsu began to flee. Meanwhile, the stranger's situation was going much worse. Blood was flowing from her mouth. She was furious as she had been told it was supposed to be here. Could it be that Jago Gui, the scoundrel, had deceived her? A monster emerged from the darkness. It roared very loudly like a beast. At that moment, Jongsu came to the rescue. He diverted the monster's attention from the stranger. Jongsu was about to pounce on the monster immediately. But the monster turned out to be no ordinary foe. Its skill was impressive. Both of them were shocked by this. Finally, Jongsu realized that before him stood his teacher, Changmun. A lump stuck in his throat from pain and resentment. He asked his partner if she had found the medicine. The box in her hand spoke for itself. Jongsu told her that all the details could wait for later, but right now he wanted to know if she could walk. The stranger replied that she was standing on her feet, but was not sure she could make it through all this hell. Jongsu asked sarcastically if his partner had hoped for a peaceful stroll. She got angry that he did not support her and said that he could have, before she could finish. Jongsu had already refused, but the boy said he understood what she wanted to ask him, but he was not going to carry her. Jongsu asked her to stand aside and began to approach Changmun. He told the master that it was a rather sad end for the leader of the Vulcan School, but now he promised to grant Changmun peace, after which he pounced on the master. In his mind, Jongsu had imagined meeting the director a million times, who had not kept his promise and betrayed him. But Jongsu never thought their meeting would be like this. A battle between a monster and a former student. The skill of both was unparalleled. They were not fighting, it was a dance. In life, Jongsu had fought with his teacher, but now it was entirely different. As expected, Changmun was much stronger than before. In that case, Jongsu had no choice but to reveal all his cards. The Sword of the Blooming Plum, the 9th form, 24 steps of the Sword of the Blooming Plum. A powerful energy flew toward Changmun from above. He had no choice but to accept defeat. Changmun's body bled, not a single living part remained on him. But now the main question was whether it worked. The blood from the director's body evaporated, and the wounds began to close. Jongsu was struck dumb. How could this be? The stranger said that this was one of the special dead, a true demon, and he could command others. Jongsu was genuinely frightened, but pretended not to believe this nonsense. The stranger regretted having trusted him and asked him to at least listen to her words this time. It turned out that there was only one way to kill such a monster. One had to shatter the core within its body and sever its head. Otherwise, it would regenerate. And the core was located differently in each demon, which was why they were so difficult to deal with. Suddenly, Jongsu's eyes widened sharply. With them, there were so many. And at that moment, another monster appeared, one that the boy had supposedly killed earlier. His heart sank to his feet. He wanted to give up. Now he was facing not one but two monsters, two of his teachers. Jongsu realized that these were indeed the same special infected, but the stranger had said she hadn't seen them here. He asked her if she could have surveyed the area better. Without letting her explain, Jongsu said that in any case they would now have to deal with these monsters. The teacher was the first to pounce on the stranger. She stood in shock, stunned. Jongsu hadn't expected this either. The monster lunged at the stranger. It was right up close. She stood frozen and simply closed her eyes, covering her face with her hand. Suddenly, the monster's hand was severed by a red light. Jongsu always kept his promise. He would never leave his partner in trouble. But this was not the only danger. Due to his inattention, Jongsu was attacked from behind. The blow was so strong that it swept him away like a hurricane. He crashed sharply and hard against the wall, blood spilling from his mouth. But he was not one to give up easily. Jongsu merely laughed at how nimble this scoundrel was. Who would have believed he would ever fight a demon? That thought somehow made him feel more invigorated. With that motivation, Jongsu executed several skillful moves. His agility was mesmerizing. It was a dance of the sword in Jongsu. The monsters received several responses in the form of gifts from the boy's sword. They immediately retaliated, enraged by this. 2 against 1. That was not what Jongsu had been taught at the Vulcan School. But this did not scare him. He deftly defended against all attacks. Although it wasn't effective, Jongsu could try another approach. The Plum Blossom Sword, 11 forms, 24 steps of the Plum Blossom Sword. He lunged at the monsters from above, flying with great speed. It worked and pierced the monsters. The teacher monster was left headless. Breathless, Jongsu killed one monster. Therefore, he could take down the second as well. He couldn't just leave it like that. He began to chant a spell. Even in the darkness, the light of the plum blossom was visible. The sword of the dark plum blossom. The 15th form, the style of the dark, deceased plum fragrance. Jongsu struck Changmun with several significant blows, but he did not stop there. Immediately after, he executed the third form of the Dark Valley plum blossom style. This dealt several more significant blows. Jongsu was utterly exhausted. He had little strength left. But the monster still held on, despite looking disgraceful. It was already irritating Jongsu. When would Changmun finally die? But something did happen. Even the stranger couldn't believe it. Jongsu had immobilized this demon. He couldn't believe it himself. Such pleasant news gave him new strength to defeat this scoundrel. Changmun seemed to be bound by invisible threads and could do nothing, not even stir. Blood flowed from his mouth. He fell to the ground, motionless. Jongsu approached him. He raised his sword to deliver the final blow that would end this monster forever. But this was not just any monster, no matter how painful it was. But such a terrible death, it was not meant to happen to such a respected person. The partner was glad that Jongsu had done it. But Jongsu felt a deep bitterness in his heart. He had just experienced a great loss. She distracted him from his sorrow. She said they should flee before other dead appeared. Jongsu sheathed his sword. He grabbed his redundant partner and ordered her to go, for there was nothing more to do here. After which he jumped high along with her, and just in time as new monsters arrived, thirsting for blood. But now they were safe. Nothing threatened them. Jongsu led the stranger to the heart of Mount Chamhwe. He simply dropped her without even a warning. She was outraged, saying it could have been done more gently. After all, she was injured. Jongsu looked at her. He said she didn't look like someone about to die. What was she even doing there? Suddenly, her eyes darted, her voice fell silent. Jongsu understood everything. She had simply wanted to steal something. What would have happened if Jongsu hadn't come? The stranger apologized but understood he just wanted to yell at her. When the emotions subsided, Jongsu asked if she was hurt. But at first glance, it was hard to tell. It would take time to see if she had been infected. After which, she said there was good news, as she had gotten what she wanted. Jongsu shouted again that it was worth dying for, and besides, she had told him she hadn't seen those special monsters. The stranger sheepishly said she hadn't seen him there, after which she changed the subject, asking how Jongsu had killed him. The monster hadn't recovered from his attacks. But Jongsu didn't understand either. He thought it was meant to be that way. Suddenly, the stranger began to cough up blood. It was not a good sign. Jongsu asked how to tell if she was infected or not. But it was hard to judge without a bite. They could only wait. Symptoms of infection include high fever and severe thirst. The stranger said to check her pupils if she lost consciousness. She added that if her pupils disappeared, Jongsu would have to end her suffering. Jongsu commented that it was a decisive approach. The stranger needed to lie down for a bit. But Jongsu wouldn't mind resting a little too. Some time passed and the stranger woke up. Her mouth was completely dry. Her pupils had vanished and her body ached. She was turning into a monster. Jongsu woke up. He had expected this. After which, he fulfilled the stranger's last request. Their meeting had been too brief, but it seemed her pupils reappeared. Did she get lucky this time? The stranger woke up to water being poured on her. Jongsu had brought it. She slowly opened her eyes. Jongsu asked if she had finally come to her senses. The stranger felt terrible. Her head was splitting, and she asked what he meant by finally. It turned out she had been unconscious for 3 days. But there was good news. It seemed she was not infected, and Jongsu congratulated her on postponing death. The stranger realized she had indeed gotten lucky this time. Then she understood she had been moved and asked where this place was. Jongsu explained that he had spent the last 3 years of his life here. His partner noted that the place looked quite safe. He said they would set off on their journey once she fully regained her senses. The boy exhaled with relief, and he promised himself, his sister, and his teacher that Jongsu would return to them soon. Meanwhile, it was broad daylight. Jongsu and the stranger set off on their journey. He asked how long the road to Shanxi, the gathering of survivors, would take. It turned out to be about a month. The stranger ordered Chonsu not to say too much, as she didn't want everyone to know they had delayed because of her, for she was known for her agility there. Chonsu joked about her agility and added that there was plenty to scold her for. And he asked how things were in Shanxi overall. It was generally almost safe there. It was considered the last stronghold of Murim in Shanxi. Most other cities had turned to ruins. Among the surviving leaders was one of the best masters of Murim. Chonsu was intrigued. He asked if there was such a person in Shanxi. The stranger replied that he had recently joined, but there was indeed such a master. Thanks to him, Shanxi was beginning to get back on its feet, the master of the invisible fist. He possessed incredible strength, capable of bringing down a mountain with a single blow. Their journey could not be called easy. Various things had happened over the month. They would certainly have stories to remember and tell. But still, they managed to get through everything. And they finally arrived. The stranger said that as soon as they crossed the ridge, they would enter Shanxi's territory. The path was long, but was it worth it? Suddenly, the sounds of battle reached them. Chonsu immediately understood that it was not so safe here. He set off ahead to check. The stranger followed him. Chonsu was outraged that she had promised it was safe here, but it had been when she left. When they arrived, they saw the site of a great battle. A huge pile of monsters, they were everywhere. Even an army in armor was fighting. But there were more demons, and they weren't dying. Chonsu rushed to help. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the previous day, the gathering of Murim, Shanxi province. The elders had gathered for a discussion. The head of the southern outskirts school, the current head of Shanxi, asked what news they had. The head of the vagabonds, Yaoul Gi, said there was information that a large number of the dead were approaching them. The head of Taiyuan School, Baek Gan, replied that this was not news and that it was pointless to raise the alarm so early. But this time things were different, as there were now several hundred of those demons. General of the 1,000-strong battalion, Mak Chong, replied that they didn't care about the numbers. The head of Shanxi calmed them, saying they needed to think rationally, as their numbers were not small and they had to be prepared for anything. Taiyuan would take the east. The battalion would stand at the main gates. The wanderers will head west, and they will cover the rear. He asked if there were any objections, but his voice carried an undertone of intimidation. Thus, no one had any objections. The day was to be difficult, so they began preparing already. When everyone had left, Deputy Head of Shanxi, Aikal Samain, approached and said that the meeting had not gone very smoothly. The head added that they all seemed to have forgotten whom they owed their lives to, after which he said he was glad to see Aikal Samain. They bowed to him. Aikal Samain stated that everything was going according to plan. The head asked if they really had to go through with this. Was there truly no other way? Aikal Samain repeated that at this rate, they would not survive the winter. The head winked at him, saying he was sure the deputy would make the right decision. One hand cannot feed 10, even if it is the hand of such a generous person. Behind was the servant, bowing, and he left while the leader spoke. Meanwhile, events shifted back to reality, where a bloody battle was taking place. The army unleashed thousands of sword arrows. They delivered an immediate result against all the monsters. Suddenly, a massive titan appeared, arrows shattered against its stone body. This was a special monster, and it revived once more. Although there was one who fought quite skillfully against the monsters, General Mak Chong did not abandon his battalion and was the best warrior. But the army was afraid, for there were too many monsters. Their losses were not great, but there were more demons than they had been told. The general ordered them to hold the enemy. The army wanted to object, but Mak Chong shouted for them to follow his orders. Thus, the battalion charged into battle. Although they were not very skilled, as they almost immediately turned into monsters. Now there were even more demons, their numbers overwhelming. The army understood that at this rate, they would all simply die here. It seemed that now was the time for General Mak Chong to draw his blade. He charged into battle to save his troops. It was no wonder he was a general, as monsters fell one by one to his sword. But it turned out they had flanked them. The head of the Taiyuan School was also fighting, and he was doing well. But those pampered ones from the head irritated him. They just stood by and watched. But some were also fighting. They tried to prevent the monsters from getting closer. There were far more of them than they had expected. The wanderers in the west would not be able to hold them back. And they had orders to protect the rear, so they had to help. The wanderers were indeed struggling. There were too many corpses. Thus, the monsters pushed further. This meant that the first line of defense had already been breached. They had not held. But this army was afraid and knew they could not manage alone. Suddenly, something whistled and approached them all at great speed. The landing was so powerful that all the monsters were scattered by the shockwave, and a small girl landed. When she was seen, they called her a great master who had come to save them. The battle progressed much faster now. Jongsu also joined the fight. The leaders realized that help had arrived. The head of Shanxi was irritated, as it seemed he had expected a worse outcome. The wanderers could barely stay on their feet, their leader as well. Then that little girl appeared. Someone called her mistress, and she called him an ugly boy. But he didn't care. He was grateful that the mistress had saved their lives, so she could call him ugly for the rest of his life. But he could rest easy, for she would not let them die. Suddenly, someone called for a brother, but the ugly boy thought something was ringing in his ear. Again, they called for brother Guandu. On the third call, the ugly boy finally turned around and saw Jongsu there. Now Guandu was calling for his brother and joyfully running to Jongsu. He couldn't believe his eyes, opening his arms wide for a hug. But Jongsu stopped him. Did Guandu really intend to embrace? The ugly boy pretended it hadn't happened, just happy to see Jongsu, and asked where he had been. Jongsu reminded him that he had been trapped in a cave and had just recently come out. Guandu had completely forgotten about that. The stranger approached at the moment when Guandu was asking how Jongsu had learned about Shanxi. Guandu was shocked at how they had ended up together. But Jongsu did not want to dwell on this. He was curious about where his sister was and if the teacher was alive. One resident of the South was watching their conversation. He did not understand who they were, but it didn't matter. The main thing was that they were all safe, for the demon army had finally been defeated. Meanwhile, events shifted to another meeting, where the head of the Wanderers was outraged that there had been no reinforcements. The leader of Shanxi ordered him to calm down, but he could not simply calm down, for they had hundreds of dead, and what were the residents of the South doing at that time? Yalgi was ordered to watch his tongue, but then the leader of Shanxi intervened, saying that there was a grain of truth in his words. For they all knew that in critical situations, everything went out of control. The leader said it was their fault for underestimating the situation and paying for it. But from this moment on, they would pay more attention to reconnaissance. With that, the meeting was adjourned. Meanwhile, Jongsu was outraged that his sister and teacher were not here. Guandu tried to explain that the situation was difficult. Jongsu asked if his brother had abandoned his younger sister. Guandu spoke very slowly and poorly, saying it wasn't quite like that, and he roughly understood where they had gone. It turned out they had gone to Hubei province, which was controlled by Murim. Many from Hua had gone there. Jongsu hoped that things were going much better there than here. Then he asked who that snotty girl was, as he could not stand children. It turned out she was the granddaughter of the master of the invisible fist, and that was why she was where she wanted to be. Suddenly, Guandu began to cry, rejoicing that he had his brother Jongsu back, for without him, he felt utterly miserable here. Jongsu wanted to hear more about this. It turned out that the Vulcan School was not respected here at all, but Guandu believed that with Jongsu, everything would be different. Suddenly, someone called out loudly for Soso. Guandu jumped up abruptly, his expression changing to one of fear. Jongsu's ears rang from such a loud shout. It turned out that the mistress had not told her grandfather that she had gone to Guandu. The boy understood that trouble was coming. At that moment, the mistress suggested playing hide-and-seek. Jongsu understood that the little troublemaker had something planned. Guandu tried to hold the mistress back, for it was better for them to leave now. Another scream rang out, and the ugly boy understood that his end was near. Then the master of the invisible fist, Uguan, arrived. He was a burly old man with a muscular body and scars. The granddaughter immediately hid behind Jongsu. She found it amusing that she had been caught. Uguan grabbed Guandu by the head and asked what his granddaughter was doing with them, little brats. Jongsu replied aggressively that Soso was not needed by them. She had just been chatting. He asked the burly man why he was shouting. Uguan was simply furious at such treatment. He decided that he must have misheard due to his age. Jongsu wouldn't say such things. He wasn't suicidal. Jongsu's partner immediately ran to cover his mouth before he could say that he didn't care. Guandu was trying to ingratiate himself with Uguan, saying they were very glad to see the master. But the old man began to shout and threaten that if he saw him with his granddaughter again, he would break his neck. Guandu could barely hold back tears, trying to prove that Soso was just playing here. But Uguan did not believe any of it. Jongsu broke free from the stranger's grasp. She begged him to be quiet. But when had he ever listened to anyone? Jongsu asked Uguan who he was to decide whose neck to break. It seemed the old man was only pleased by this, for he realized he hadn't misheard. Jongsu confirmed that he had heard correctly. The stranger and Guandu quietly wanted to escape before it was too late. Guan asked what Jongsu was planning to do to him. The boy stepped closer to the master and said he would knock those thoughts out of his head. Guan asked if he had enough strength for that, as the Vulcan School was good for nothing. Jongsu got angry and said the master would pay for those words. He was simply burning with rage and aggression. And Guan seemed the same. It appeared a fierce battle was about to begin. Suddenly, the furious Soso screamed very loudly. The others had to cover their ears. The granddaughter scolded her grandfather for insulting others. And the burly master Guan defended himself to his granddaughter, saying Jongsu had started it first. Soso replied to her grandfather that all his old ladies called him old man all the time. Well, how could the granddaughter not understand that this was entirely different? Then she began to sulk, saying she was tired of playing hide and seek and was going home. Soso turned and quickly ran away. Guan told the snotty boy Jongsu that this time he was very lucky, but he should not expect to be so lucky next time. The stranger and Guandu could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But who was Jongsu to be like this? The world was on the brink of collapse, and he only exacerbated everything with his antics. The stranger agreed that if Jongsu wanted to die, he should not drag the rest along with him. But Jongsu did not want to hear this. He wanted to know what had happened on Hua Mountain and what had happened to his sister and teacher. Guandu said that first, this uninvited guest would leave, hinting at the stranger. She got him angry and told Guandu to leave, but he said he was planning to leave anyway, so the angry stranger departed. But in the end, she decided to thank Jongsu once more. She owed him a debt, and he could ask for anything he wanted. Guandu joked that Jongsu had probably fallen in love, as that was not like him at all. Meanwhile, events shifted to the quarters of the master of the invisible fist. There, Guan was scolding his granddaughter for once again killing the undead by herself. Soso tried to prove that she was strong and not afraid of them, and she wanted to take revenge for her mom and dad. These words struck what seemed to be a burly and stern man right in the heart. His voice changed, becoming softer. He understood the pain of his granddaughter. Suddenly, the grandfather began to cry and apologized for not being there at that time. He looked at his granddaughter and asked her to promise that she would trust no one but him. Soso promised him this. Guan was now certain that this scoundrel needed to be watched closely. And it turned out that he was also from the Vulcan School. He couldn't believe that those who survived remained on Mount Hua, and it must be admitted that he had strength. Well, at least he wouldn't be bored. Meanwhile, Jongsu asked Guandu to tell him everything in detail. It all began shortly after Jongsu was imprisoned in the cave. Back then, rumors circulated about demons appearing near the border. They kept people in fear and pain. In the end, this plague engulfed the entire world. And the Vulcan School was no exception. One night, an entire army of the undead attacked the school. The most dangerous were the special undead, for which their school was unprepared. One by one, everyone turned into walking corpses. And to protect the remnants of those who survived, the teacher decided to sacrifice himself. He bought them time, and they managed to escape. But in the end, this disease followed them. They did not want history to repeat itself. So they decided to split into two groups. The group that included the sister headed to the Murim territory. Overall, it was very strange, as the demons caught up with them far too quickly. And their teacher's skill was unmatched. He was the strongest among them, yet he could not hold back the demons for long. Only Jongsu could match Chamhwe. But the boy found this comparison strange. He was curious why his brother had been so confident in him. Guandu, for some reason, became very anxious, mumbling to himself. Then he gathered his thoughts to tell the truth. But Jongsu heard something at that moment. He gestured for Guandu to be quiet. The boy looked around to understand what was happening. Suddenly, Jongsu said that it was all over now. Guandu understood nothing. He thought that after 3 years alone, his brother had lost his mind. Jongsu asked if an uninvited guest had visited them. Guandu immediately thought of Shuntu. But that was nonsense. Why would she come here? Jongsu suddenly smiled and said it was an interesting place. Whoever it was, Jongsu knew he was already gone, so Guandu could continue. Meanwhile, the event shifted to a meeting. There was Baek Gan, the head of the school, and Yao Gi, the leader of the vagabonds, who was not very pleased with the meeting. He thought Baek Gan wanted to see the pathetic and poor vagabonds. Yao Gi had a fiery temperament, of course, but Baek Gan had other intentions. It was necessary to keep the southern outskirts in check, and for that they needed to unite. Yao Gi shouted that if he was called only for this nonsense, he would leave. Even if they gathered all their remnants into one, it was on par with the southern outskirts. It hadn't always been this way, but their people were dying every day and continued to die. Therefore, Baekgan proposed an alliance. But what would change then? The situation had to improve, for as long as Master Yuguan lived, even the southern outskirts could not do whatever they pleased. Baekgan asked what happened to the vagabonds when they entrusted him. This question angered the already fiery Yalgi. Baekgan asked him to think carefully. Yalgi had further questions about the other sides. Wouldn't it be difficult for them if only they united? Baekgan wanted to take care of everything himself. He had a way. Yalgi had suspicions, but for some reason, believed him and agreed to the arrangement. The deal was in place. Meanwhile, Jongsu tried to understand if his brother instinctively felt danger when it was nearby. It wasn't always the case, but sometimes Guandu experienced such feelings. But not always did intuition tell the truth, so Jongsu wanted to verify it. He asked to recount each person from the Vulcan School in order. Guandu began to list everyone, counting on his fingers. Jongsu said that was enough, not perfect, but almost correct. He praised Guandu for through him the group could survive, and only Jongsu knew about this ability. His brother asked to keep this a secret, but Jongsu was still curious about where the other teachers were. Guandu, with tears in his eyes, said that most of them had died. There were even those who hadn't made it here and those who had already died here. Jongsu fell into a panic. Was it really that bad? Only about 3 to 4 people remained. And at that moment, someone entered. 2 men in the same uniform as they were, and the first asked if that scoundrel was alive. Jongsu felt that something very interesting was about to happen. Guandu bowed to the elders. The teacher was outraged that if Jongsu had returned, he should at least greet them. The second teacher shouted that the elders had been completely disrespected. Jongsu calmly agreed and asked about their health. Of course, this only angered the teachers even more. But still, luck was on Jongsu's side that he had made it here alive. Jongsu agreed but added that the same could be said for them. After all, they were still alive too. The boy had almost forgotten how fun it was to irritate teachers after 3 years. Suddenly, the teacher became very sweet and said that Jongsu had made a long journey, so it was time to forget old grievances. After all, it was a difficult time for living. Guandu nodded behind him, after which the teacher ordered them to rest, as they were probably tired, and left. Jongsu suspected something strange about the teacher's behavior. He said he had intentionally provoked them. After all, the world had changed, and Jongsu wanted to know how much people had changed. But Guandu said that here they still had to follow Uncle Okian's words, as he had the authority to distribute missions. This literally meant the power to assign missions. Meanwhile, the teachers discussed Jongsu's behavior, but the boy was of outstanding strength among the students. And Okian knew that in the situation that had occurred, he needed to recruit him. Although he was a fidgety person by nature, but he had something in mind, so there was nothing to worry about. After all, if a dangerous mission was entrusted, someone had to step forward. Okay, Yan called it killing 2 birds with 1 stone. This was all overheard. He reported everything to the head of Shanxi about the interesting boy who had appeared. The boy was a student of a great teacher and had significant strength. But this did not interest the leader. He had no need for unnecessary worries. However, he was from the Vulcan School, so caution was warranted. The leader knew that Shen Tu had shown him the way, and this angered him. He said he had had enough. The messenger trembled and was afraid. The leader threatened him with imprisonment and physical punishment. He apologized and fell to the ground. The leader forgave him this time, but promised to punish him if it happened again. Meanwhile, a new day arrived. The vagabonds were patrolling. It had been about a year since the new influx of people had stopped. But this time, rumors said a new student from the Vulcan School had arrived. However, they did not believe it would change anything. They were just glad it was a patrol, for if they received a mission somewhere far away, and why did they always send them somewhere distant? Surely there had to be a reason. They were probably searching for something there. Suddenly, one man sensed something and ordered to freeze. His partner was anxious and panicking. In the distance, there was something, some screams and noise. Suddenly, the patrol's expression changed sharply. They turned pale. They immediately began to flee as a crowd of demon monsters was chasing them. But they ran in the opposite direction. They had no choice, as there was a horde of those scoundrels on the other road. Finally, they managed to distance themselves a little, but it was strange how they had appeared so suddenly, as no one had lost vigilance. Did the undead want to block their escape route? But where did they get so much brains? In any case, they had to find a way back to return. Suddenly, another strange sound was heard. Out of fear, the partner looked around in a panic. But she heard nothing and thought it was just her imagination. Unfortunately for him, it was not just his imagination. The patrol froze in fear. A shadow burst out from the bushes. Before them stood a very strange demon that didn't even look like the rest of the undead. The patrol could breathe a sigh of relief as they felt no danger from this monster. The partner said she could handle it herself. Suddenly, a satisfied smile appeared on the undead's face. She said it was a pity he had turned into a monster at such a young age and wished him to rest in peace. She drew her sword, and she was about to strike, when suddenly a horde of monsters rushed out from the bushes. The patrol realized they were doomed. The monsters pounced on them in a group. The people simply had no chance. It was a very bloody and dishonest fight. Meanwhile, events shifted to the village. There, people stood in line. The leader was distributing food. An old man was outraged that it was far too little. How could anyone survive on just this? The crowd rebelled and asked for more. Then another man arrived to find out what had happened. He was informed that their portions were too small. The man's expression changed sharply and became stern. He wanted to know specifically who was responsible. The crowd grew fearful and fell silent. The old man stammered that they were very hungry. Then he was told to go and look for more. After all, there was nothing more to give. They needed someone to bring it. The old man's hands trembled, and he replied that it was not necessary. Among the crowd was Jongsu, who was observing this. He mentioned the food shortage to Guandu and suggested looking for food outside. Guandu explained that there was a patrol team for food searching, but it was not that simple. Jongsu said it wasn't so dangerous that they shouldn't go out at all. But everything in the vicinity had already been exhausted, so they needed to go far to find food, especially since even if they went, they wouldn't be able to bring back much because the area could be dangerous. It was a tough situation. Suddenly, the children stood up abruptly because they saw the great master Soso, and she, in turn, noticed the scary boy. For him, it was not a pleasant encounter. She immediately ran away sharply with her eyes closed and crashed into Guandu right in the stomach with her head. It seemed as if his insides would spill out. He immediately seemed to give up. The girl was delighted that she had won. Guandu played along, saying that no one could overcome such a great master. Jongsu asked his brother what he was doing. Guandu replied that he was just fooling around. But this irritated Jongsu. He didn't understand why it was being done. Guandu himself seemed not to understand either. Jongsu cracked his knuckles and asked if it wasn't time to get a little serious. Guandu understood everything at once. Suddenly, Soso intervened. She yelled at Jongsu for insulting the scary boy. Jongsu called her a brat and ordered her to go play elsewhere before she got scolded. Soso was outraged, saying she was not a brat, and demanded that he apologize to her. Jongsu was curious where this child had picked up such a foolish habit and said that her grandfather's influence worked on others, but not on him. He greatly angered Soso, and it seemed he enjoyed it. Jongsu leaned toward her and breathed in her face, after which he smugly said that he had won. Soso called him a thief, and Jongsu stuck his tongue out at her, saying that he had won, therefore he was better. Guandu watched this and did not understand who else needed to become more serious, and asked why Soso had come here. It turned out she was hungry and had come to eat. Today she was without her grandfather because she had been left alone, but Soso could manage well without him. Guandu praised her, saying she was good and capable on her own. But she shouldn't go alone, as the master would be looking for her again. However, since her grandfather had left, she had no other choice. Suddenly, Soso covered her mouth with her hands, as her grandfather had asked her not to say that. She ordered them to keep it a secret, especially the scary boy. Guandu was frightened that the master had gone outside. However, Soso ordered him not to worry, as she would keep an eye on everything. Then someone else joined them. He bowed to the master and inquired about the purpose of their visit. Soso proudly lifted her chin. The messenger added that if the matter was about food, he would deliver her a separate and larger portion. But Soso said she wanted to eat here with the uncles. He replied that the food here would not be enough for a great master, as she needed to eat well to protect the people. Soso grew anxious and blushed. Then Jongsu intervened, saying that she wanted to eat here, so why was the messenger butting in where he shouldn't? To which he replied that he intervened when it was necessary, as this was how one had to live here if they wanted to live longer. There was a strong tension between the two of them. Then an angry Soso intervened. The messenger immediately calmed down, apologized for contradicting the will of the great master, and promised to bring enough food for her to eat here, after which he bowed and left. But in the end, he still said that if they wanted to continue living here, they had to be careful, as next time he wouldn't let it go so easily. The messenger was furious, but knew that sooner or later they would meet again. Jongsu was outraged that there were so many annoying people in this place. Guandu asked why they were so irritated, as the rest were just trying to be nice. Soso did not like this and despised it. Jongsu said there was no point in asking, as just by looking at them, it was clear they were a disaster. Soso was quite perceptive. She called Jongsu a stingy old man, but not too bad. But the boy didn't care, he just left because he wanted to eat. Meanwhile, at the residence, there was simply a charmingly set table. There was a plethora of food to choose from. A person could not physically eat it all. The leader set down his chopsticks, saying he had lost his appetite. He told Akal Samayan that he had a feeling these people were working together. The head of the vagabonds interjected that they had problems, as 2 patrol members had not returned yet. The leader simply expressed his condolences, but added that they needed to be more careful. But Yalgi was not satisfied with such condolences. Then Baekhan spoke up. He had something to say about it. He had heard that the volcano had been reinforced, so he suggested involving them in missions again. He wanted to form a team with Jongnam, as they had done before. The leader said that was nonsense. Moreover, one person was far too few, to which Baekhan retorted that they also had a very small army. Yalgi supported Baekhan and suggested holding a vote this time. Baekhan beamed with satisfaction. The leader was irritated but tried to find support in the army's opinion. But the general felt the same way. Leader Shanxi simply laughed. He clearly understood their intentions, so he decided to try their idea. Aikal Samain said it was a bit late for that. It was strange, as even the general voted without hesitation. The messenger apologized as he wanted to step away. He realized it was time for him to go. The leader asked when they were left alone how safe this place was. And Aikal Saman had something to say about that. They had found clues that could lead them to their hideout. The leader was frightened. He was genuinely scared, as he understood that without support, he would simply be destroyed. He wanted to discreetly find out where they were. It was a volcano in the north. The leader did not believe it. It was just gossip, as that was the homeland of the water spirits to begin with. But now the question was whether they had managed to develop it. In any case, these were risks, and they had to choose who would go there. The volcano was thousands of miles away. It would be a difficult and dangerous journey. The leader asked if the casualties were important, but they were secondary means, as their future was more important.